Steelix, in its TCG form, lives up to the in-game form in that it is very defensive. And Steelix was in a very odd predicament at this point in the TCG because depending on what the metagame was and how it had shifted at the time, Steelix could either do very well or very poorly. It had high HP and it could take advantages of the special metal energies, but it has a weakness to fire, and Typhlosion Arcanine was a pretty big deck at the time. It had a resistance to grass types, which were plentiful at the time as well because of Feraligatr, and Steelix itself could handle Feraligatr fairly well. Because it had such high HP, your opponent would have to build up a pretty heavy discard in order to one-hit KO. And Steelix did run things like Goldberry and Focus Band that would make it even harder for Feraligatr. So if you showed up to an event where everyone was running anti-Feraligatr decks, they were using things like Dark Mug, Dark Vileplume, Steelix could actually do pretty well because it didn't rely too heavily on trainers and it had that resistance to grass types. However, if you came to a tournament or event where Blaine's Arcanine was very heavy, people had started using the Cinnabar Gym Stadium to offset the weakness to Feraligatr. So it really depended on how the metagame had shifted on how well the Steelix deck could do. Much like every other big deck at the time, Steelix sought to deal with its weaknesses by just loading them down with babies and trying to stall them out. So let's get into this build of Steelix with babies! I'll be running a playset of the Onyx from Neo Genesis. Unfortunately, the Southern Islands collection hadn't come out yet. I much prefer that version of Onyx to this one. However, this one does have some advantages that we'll get into later. I'll also be using a full playset of Steelix from Neo Genesis. And you'll notice too that two of my Steelix are Japanese. It just happened that whenever I was building up my collection at the time that these sets were releasing, the local card shops or places that I got cards got in the Japanese versions of sets before they were translated into English. So I ended up with a lot of Japanese versions of some of these cards. And you'll notice that across videos as well. And as I said earlier, Steelix had a lot of weaknesses to fire Pokemon. You had Typhlosion, Arcanine, a lot of Magbies out there. So one way to deal with those was to use Murkrow. If you got an Arcanine that you could double gust out and then use Mean Look on, you could kind of trap it and hope that it couldn't build up the 4 energy it needed to attack fast enough. So then you could start using feint attacks on Pokemon that were actually built up on the bench, maybe an Arcanine that already had full energy. Elekid's another option, as it can use that Playful Punch ability. When you're in between your setups and you don't really have much to do, you could just Playful Punch instead of attack. You could put out any kind of baby Pokemon with a Focus Band on it, usually Cleffa. Cleffa's in here just as a hand refresher, so if your hand's looking pretty good, you have everything you need. You just need a couple more turns to build up a Steelix on the bench. You could use Playful Punch to just deal a solid chunk of damage to whatever your opponent's active is. And you're going to be using Cleffa more sparingly than usual. You're going to be using Pichu a lot more. Just because of the metagame, Pichu's going to be zapping several Pokemon for 20 damage. You know, you have your Feraligatr, your Slowkings, your Typhlosions, Meganium, Dark Mug, Dark Vileplume, Giovanni's Machamp. Almost every single major deck in the Rocketon format used Pokemon that had powers, except for this one. So you could really take advantage of Pichu's Zap attack and start dealing spread damage across your opponent's Pokemon. Goldberry is in here mainly for Steelix. You're going to be throwing down those Goldberries and hoping that it lives the next attack. It's most likely going to, because if you have at least one metal energy attached to Steelix, you can almost guarantee it's not going to get O-code very easily. The Focus Bands are in here mainly for your baby Pokemon, so that if Steelix comes up against something that it can't quite deal with, you can just throw a Focus Band on a baby Pokemon or a Murkrow and try to circumvent whatever their strategy is by either attacking their bench or using Pichu's Zap attack to deal spread damage across your opponent's Pokemon depending on how many are running powers. Energy charges in here just to get back those metal energy if a Steelix gets knocked out. as well as Murkrow. Murkrow is going to be using darkness energies that you can get back from the discard using energy charge. Of course, got to run 4 copies because it's off of a coin flip. And Double Gust is in here just as any other deck that's running a lot of babies. Steelix is going to be your only Pokemon that has a retreat cost. So if your opponent is met with a Double Gust, they pretty much have to bring out a Steelix. Otherwise, they're going to bring out a Pokemon that has a free retreat cost that is just going to be switching back into a fully loaded Steelix most likely. And I will be using a full playset of Bill's Teleporter. I know it's a little risky. Just on average, you're going to be getting 2 cards, and that's only off of 2 of the 4 in the playset. So it is a bit divided on whether people think this is a decent addition to any of the Rocketon deck formats. But I think this deck benefits a lot more from draw than the other cards do. It doesn't really have any reliable search. And Nightly Garbage Run is going to be in here just to try to get back some of those useful cards. If you lose a Steelix, you can try to get one of those back so that you can fully load one on the bench again. Professor Elm is basically a trainer version of your Cleffa that isn't going to cost you a prize. So I got a couple of those in here just to make sure that you have a way to refresh your hand. If you're having to rely on a Murkrow as your active, or if you're already have your Steelix out as your active and you need a couple more support cards in your hand, you can use Professor Elm. Goop Gas is going to help you take advantage over all of the other decks that run Pokemon powers. Goop Gas will shut those down so that you can pretty much do what you need to on that turn and slow down your opponent for a turn. That way you can kind of try to shift the momentum late game. 4 of those special metal energies, when they're attached to Steelix, then any attack done to it is going to be reduced by 10. Now you could load down 3 of these on Steelix to start using that Tail Crush attack, and it's going to be taking 30 less damage from anything your opponent can throw at you. However, the strategy pretty much is going to be to get 4 Steelix on your bench with 1 metal energy per Steelix on them. You really only want to load down all of them on one single Steelix whenever you're up against something like a Feraligatr that you think will be dealing 150 damage to you. 4 copies of Full Heal Energy as well, because a lot of these Pokemon use colorless energy, so you can use Full Heal Energy to get rid of those pesky special conditions, and Recycle Energy. That way, if these Pokemon are being sent to the discard, you're getting those colorless energy back. And you may notice as I pan down here, this deck runs no basic energy, it's all special energy, which makes this deck super fun to play. Because this deck is so weak to Fire-type Pokemon, I tried to run a couple of coverage cards and see how they worked. Probably the best one was Mantine to help counter those Fire-type Pokemon, but it couldn't really deal enough damage to cause too much of a threat to a Typhlosion or a Blaine's Arcanine. So these water types really just bog down the deck. I would have to add basic energy cards to use them. So I think just the regular version and the reliance on babies is enough to get the deck by. You're definitely not going to be winning like 100% of your matchups against Fire-type Pokemon, but it at least gives you a chance to retreat a Steelix or at least double gust it back to your bench and then rely on a Pichu to help deal spread damage, which helps you get KOs later in the game because Steelix's attack isn't going to be dealing too much damage. It's 50 at the most, which isn't going to OHKO anything. It'll be at least a 3-hit KO most of the time. So having Pichu deal that 20 damage to a lot of the threats in the format would help Steelix get set up for its own knockouts later in the game. Most builds of this deck don't run Bill's Teleporter, however, I found that the draw power that it offered, even though it's not consistent, helped to get set up a lot more early game than other builds. Most builds go for 4 copies of Recall. That way you can use Onyx's Rage attack later in the game. If your Steelix gets a lot of damage on it, you can deal up to 120 damage, which is much better than its attack. However, you are reliant on getting Recall in your hand, and you would have to run fighting energy in your deck. You would have to add those basic energy cards in. And as always, you could substitute in Double Gust for Warp Point depending on your own personal preference, since you could be able to Warp Point into a baby Pokemon and then retreat right back into a Steelix for your active. I don't really have much more to add to this deck. Like a lot of other Rocketon decks, the strategy is very straightforward. There's not a whole lot of deviation between these builds. So if you guys have any thoughts or extra comments, things you would want to add to this deck, let me know. Possibly things that I've missed. And as always, just thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time for more Rocketon decks.